You know we love to compare the conferences here at MarkRogersTV. Each off-season, what we do is we take all the results of the Power 5 games and we break them down based on seeding and put them into context. We're working on that right now. We've done that the last two off-seasons, and now we've added a new wrinkle. Basically, what we've done here is completely subjective. So I've matched up the ACC against the Pac-12 and the Big 12. Check out those videos. Now it's the ACC versus the SEC. Interesting in a number of ways. That most people in college football over the last 10 to 15 years have considered the SEC to be the best conference, including myself, although I believe that's been overstated. Best conference, but not by as much as a lot of people would think in the national media. The ACC, though, showed to be the best conference on the field in postseason play, in particular, winning 9 of 12 games and very important games against like-seeded teams. We put a lot of emphasis on the bowl games because they're like-seeded matchups. All right, the ACC did defeat the SEC on the field 10 times out of 14 this season. Of course, some of those games were not like-seeded games, so you can only give so much merit to Clemson defeating South Carolina, for example. But many of the games were like-seeded games, Florida State defeating Florida pretty easily, for example. All right, let's match up the ACC and the SEC. And my original thought was, okay, just match them up based on seeding and who would win the matchup. But there's a difference between a dominant matchup. If Alabama played Purdue, obviously we know Alabama would win that. But Alabama taking on Clemson, well, we saw what happened when they played in the national championship game. Clemson earned the championship, but it wasn't really decided on the field who was the best team. It was a 1-second difference. Who is the best team? Well, we don't know. We know Clemson earned the national championship that night, but Alabama may still be the best team. That's up for debate. All right, so this is a 10-game series between these two teams because obviously it would matter where they played. So if they played one game and it was neutral site, well, one team would have a certain advantage based on that could be incalculable versus obviously home field advantage. So it's a 10-game series between the ACC and the SEC. Here's how I see it. This is completely subjective. Clemson takes on Alabama. We've seen the game. Regardless, if Alabama gets 10 cracks at Clemson, I believe the Crimson Tide wins it 6-4. All right, Louisville and Florida. Now keep in mind, do I believe that Louisville's the second best team in the ACC after dropping 3 consecutive games to close the season? I don't. I believe Florida State's the second best team in the conference, but Louisville earned the number 2 seed with a 7-1 record. So Louisville's the 2 seed against Florida, 6-2 in the SEC as the 2 seed, and I see that dead even because I see Florida limited on offense, but Louisville crashing and burning to a certain extent down the stretch. And we saw Louisville take on LSU and not compete. Florida went to Baton Rouge and defeated those same Tigers. Virginia Tech and Auburn, interesting matchup here. The Hokies looked impressive down the stretch, in particular against Clemson and hanging in the ACC championship game, and of course in the big comeback from 24 down against Arkansas. Auburn, a different sort than Arkansas. Auburn thrashed the Hogs 56-3. I know that's only one game, and Auburn stumbled down the stretch to a certain extent against some really, really good competition. So they did play the number 1 seed, Oklahoma, in a bowl game. So they did lose by, 16 points? But it was a close first half, and they lost their quarterback. I got that as a 5-5 series. Okay, Florida State LSU, this would be the one series out of the entire 14-team matchup that I would want to see more than any. Florida State LSU, athletes all over the place. I'm going 5-5 on this one. LSU played extremely well down the stretch. All right, we got North Carolina, Texas A&M. Another great matchup. We're full of them here because the ACC has really upped the ante in the last couple of years. Texas A&M, though, we saw what they were capable of doing early in the season against quality competition. North Carolina is still leaking on defense. A&M wins at 6-4. All right, Miami, Tennessee, another great matchup here. I was leaning Tennessee, and I'll explain the little asterisks there. Miami, Tennessee, Canes played well down the stretch, dismantled West Virginia. I see this as a 5-5 matchup. Pitt and Georgia, same thing. I see flaws on both teams, but I see enormous potential. Georgia's the more talented roster, but Pitt, certainly against Penn State and Clemson, showed that on occasion what they're capable of. Also lost to Northwestern, a 6-6 team in postseason play. Georgia Tech, Kentucky. That one looks familiar. Oh yeah, Georgia Tech pretty much manhandled Kentucky. I don't know that that would happen across the board over 10 games. Credit Georgia Tech with a win. Both teams went 4-4 in their respective conferences. Georgia Tech wins this one over Kentucky 7-3. I think they showed us something. They proved something in the bowl game, but over 10 games, Kentucky does win 3. North Carolina State and Arkansas. Arkansas is just a more talented team that takes on a more difficult schedule week to week, and North Carolina State didn't show us a whole lot throughout the season, didn't defeat many good teams, if any. They did have an impressive bowl performance against a Vandy team lower seeded in winning by 3 or 4 scores. Okay, Arkansas wins 6-4. Mississippi State, Wake Forest. I see a similar matchup here in that Mississippi State is certainly having its issues in 2016, but much more talent, much more athleticism and speed, more dynamic on offense. Mississippi State defeats Wake Forest, but credit the Demon Deacons with that big bowl win against Temple where they really outplayed the Owls. So Wake Forest, we're giving them a level of respect there at 6-4. South Carolina, Syracuse. Syracuse, interesting that they were better seeded than Boston College despite not reaching a bowl game, not even coming close at 4-8. But the seedings work this way. Conference record, head-to-head, because those are within vacuums. Those are within the silo of the conference. They can be easily compared as opposed to non-conference schedule where one team plays an extremely difficult non-conference slate and somebody else doesn't. For example, Syracuse played a much more difficult non-conference than Boston College that did not play a Power 5. Anyway, the seedings go conference record, so they both went 2-6. Then it went head-to-head. Oh, Syracuse beat Boston College. They get the better seeding. Okay, Syracuse takes on South Carolina, and I'm fully confident the Gamecocks would win roughly 7 games out of 10. BC Vandy, difficult to differentiate that matchup 5-5. Sure, BC looked really good defensively and in spurts offensively against Maryland in the Quick Lane Bowl, but over 10 games, very spotty play out of the Eagles. Virginia, Ole Miss. Yes, Ole Miss finished very, very poorly, but they were dismantled by injuries. These are healthy teams playing here. Chad Kelly's back in the lineup. Man, maybe they do better than that against Virginia, but I'm giving the seedings some relevance here, and I'm considering the seasons for each of them in conference play at 2-6 and 1-7. But Ole Miss with Chad Kelly, they played Alabama better than anybody on the slate, excluding, in a sense, LSU and, of course, Clemson. So Ole Miss wins conservatively 7-3. Mizzou, Duke, difficult to differentiate those two teams. 4-8, 4-8. They go 5-5. So I gave the nod because I wasn't comfortable with how many 5-5 series we had. I don't want to just make it that easy on myself. So I at least give a lean to one team or the other. I believe Virginia Tech slightly better than Auburn. FSU a tad better offensively than LSU, so they get the nod there, and so forth and so on. BC over Vandy, Duke over Mizzou. I think we've got a few other matchups in there where I like Tennessee and Georgia. My thoughts on this series between the SEC and the ACC. So surprisingly, despite the better performance on the field from the ACC, when they play head-to-head, this is what I see. I see 76-64. 10 teams against each other, 14 games, that's 140 games. 76-64, and the SEC wins the series 6-1, 7 ties, but you see the leans there. That's my thought on the SEC versus the ACC, right here on Mark Rogers TV.